In conversation, open-ended questions are really helpful. Open-ended questions get people rolling, especially if you get a well-timed, well-fashioned open-ended question. You can get people rolling for an hour. Being curious about the other individual is fairly magnetic. We love curiosity because curiosity indicates to us there's something about us that someone else wants to know. So there's a lot of value there. We get self-esteem from that. And we like being considered. We like attention. That's just a natural thing for humans. So if you can be curious about the other person, they're more than likely going to like you.
So something that I struggled with a lot when I was younger is initiating conversations. I'm a lot better now, but that's something I always struggled with, is actually being the one that starts the conversation. It was always like I would only engage in conversations if someone started with me. Like I was never the one that started conversations, and I really do think that held me back. Unfortunately, I'm a lot better at it now. But where does that come from? That like hesitation to start conversations?
Well, there is the social barrier of silence that we have to get beyond for a conversation. And there's a lot of nonverbal things also that cue conversations for us. Like eye contact's really important. So I have my camera up here, but I got you down here. So I'm like going back and forth, which is, that can be hard to navigate in person, is the nonverbal side of the house. But it's clear that we are social creatures. Some people out of the box genetically are more predisposed to be a bit more extroverted and to have a bit more social bravado. They're going to be a bit more confident. Meanwhile, there are other people who are going to be a bit more introverted. They may not be as likely to initiate conversation, but that doesn't mean they're not a good conversationalist. So I think there are a few reasons why you may have been a bit shy growing up, but you have a podcast that's doing quite well, so it seems like you don't struggle with that any longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really what it is it's like a hesitation, right? It's like it's not like that I didn't want to talk to other people, but it was like a hesitation of approaching or hesitation of starting a conversation. And I'm also naturally an introvert myself. Would you consider yourself an extrovert or an introvert?
I'd consider myself an extrovert.
Oh, okay. And how do we know which end of the spectrum we land on?
Typically, it's your social battery. So we all have social batteries. And it's what charges and depletes our social battery. So for me, if I'm feeling on a deficit, say I feel like life is in a lull and I need to get things going, we charge our social battery by being around people, and that would indicate extroversion. If being around a lot of people depletes your social battery, typically that indicates introversion. That being said, there are caps and there are limits on either end. So extroverts oftentimes may experience something to where they've been around people a whole bunch. Think about like the reality TV shows. You see these people who are constantly around people all the time, cameras on. Now, if our batteries get too full, then we actually get pretty irritable and we're not good conversationalists. That's not because we don't know how to talk to people. It's just because we need to give our battery a little rest. Meanwhile, introverts, if we don't spend enough time around people, then our battery is going to get too low. So we all have different social batteries. This is what makes social connection and the loneliness problem so hard, is it's similar to the nutrition side of the house. People are in different body shapes for a lot of different reasons, right? Sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's environment, sometimes it's stress, sometimes it's financial, like not knowing what to do financially. If you have a lot of bills, it can be hard to go out and make friends. So there's so many different variables, but typically, if you charge your battery via people, extroversion. If you charge your battery via solitude, introversion.
Why do you think that some people are good at having conversations and some people aren't? Is it something that is it something that people are just born with? Is it something that is dependent on our childhoods, how we are raised? What do you think what makes someone naturally good at conversations versus not naturally good at conversations?
It shakes out to a few different things. I do, like we were saying earlier, the genetic predisposition. How you come out of the box is influential. I have always loved talking to people. At recess, I remember my friends saying like, hey, you just talk all the time. And that was a part of me. I also think practice is really big. My first job outside of graduate school was a public speaking instructor, and I got to see people week 1 being very shy and not being able to articulate their thought. Week 16, you got to actually see their personality. People actually started enjoying listening to him, more relatable. So there is practice that comes into play too. Also, your environment growing up. There are some cultures, for instance, my mom's side of the family, it's Native American, and they value silence differently than, say, my wife's side of the family, which is Italian, right? How we navigate silence, how we navigate being able to articulate our thought to fill the room, that's cultural too. So it's messy because it's a lot of intersections, and you get one person and they may have a hard time talking to people because they've been socially isolated. Meanwhile, you have another person who may have a hard time talking to someone because there's a cultural barrier or there's a discrepancy between what they're used to and what they're currently experiencing.
So for someone who may struggle, like I used to do, with initiating conversations and approaching people, what are some tips that you can give them to get better at that?
Yeah, conversation initiation is tough. It's typically what most people have the hardest time with, getting in a conversation and keeping it around. So maintaining the conversation, that is also a struggle, but a lot of people come to me reporting more troubles breaking that barrier of silence. Most of the time where I start with is the cognition. So our self-concept, what we think about ourselves, but also what we think about interacting with others. And that's what we call our social cognition. And one thing that really trips us up is what we call maladaptive social cognition. So it's somewhere in the thought process, either it's negative self-concept about our own, or we fear other people, or maybe there's a superiority complex, or there's something funky happening that makes our social interactions not great. Like there's something wrong. What's going on? So going at first, we have to think about how are we thinking about the problem. So how do you think about yourself? Oftentimes people say, I'm not interesting enough, right? I don't know how to start a conversation because I don't know what I can bring to the table. But I just had a conversation with a guy. His name's Rob. He's meeting 10,000 people, 10,000 one-on-one, 1-hour conversations. And he's been doing it for 6 years, so we're doing it for 6 more years. I was number like 6,400. And he told me one of the things I realize is a lot of people think they're not interesting enough to be in a conversation. But really, one of the things you're curious about, what you're curious about and what you're passionate about is going to be what's interesting about you, because we're all curious about different things. So we have to remove this thought that we're not interesting enough. And then the other side, I call it awe, A-W-E, awkward, weird, embarrassing. Those are typically the triple threats. We don't want to be awkward. We don't want to be weird. We don't want to be embarrassing. And the reason we don't want to be that is because we're fearful we'll get excluded. We're fearful that we're going to get kicked out of our tribe, because as humans, we need people. But the truth is, in our current society, we actually need to be doing a lot more effort getting people around us. And the more effort we put into it, the more likely people are going to take us back, because they need people too. And social sting, whenever we go out there and we talk to someone, it may sting for a second if we get rejected, but it's very temporary. Yet the results and the fruit of a quality relationship is not temporary. It's one of the best things, arguably the greatest things in life. I mean, if you look at the Harvard Happiness Study, right, the longest social science study says it's the number one key to a happy life is having quality, long-living relationships.
Yeah, and I feel like because it's so important to us, those relationships, that's why it causes so much anxiety, right? That's why that's why we get that hesitation to approach people. That's why we overthink about what we're going to say, and then when we get there, we actually like talk to the person. It's completely different. And so, what's the role of social anxiety in all of this? How do we overcome that social anxiety?
The role of social anxiety is that it's pervasive, right? Our brains are wired mostly for social situations. So Vivek Murthy, he's the current Surgeon General. In 2023, he said the biggest concern was loneliness, and he put together a big paper with all the brightest minds saying, what do we do about loneliness in America? You know, they call it the loneliness epidemic, the friendship recession. And one of the big things he was talking about is like neurologically, whenever we're a baby, we're constantly already reading people's micro expressions. So it'd be like me looking at you, looking at your eyebrows, how you smile, looking at your tonality, being able to look at your pacing, being able to see like, he seems to put a lot more effort when he's saying this. He's not looking at me now. Subconsciously, we're thinking about that. Subconsciously, there's some really interesting thing that's like the first few months as a baby, we're able to distinguish faces incredibly well. But after a few months, we're no longer able to distinguish faces that don't match our parents' ethnicity. So we even get to a point to where we identify our caretakers and we say, they're taking care of us. I need to get to know who they are. And we trash things. And after that, it's just specialization, getting to read people, trying to figure other people out. Our brains are thinking about a conversation we had in the past. Like after this podcast, I'll be like, Chris, you talked too much. Or Chris, you should have been more targeted. Before this podcast, I'm thinking, what am I going to talk about? During the podcast, I'm thinking, I wonder if I should have said that. I wonder if he's about to say this. And that's just one example, right? It goes and goes and goes. I shouldn't have said that to my mom. This upcoming speech I have, I'm nervous about that. So the amount of available energy that we give towards social situations, it's the biggest demand out of everything for our brain. It's a social machine. And with all of that put together, our brain knows we need people. So there's, like you said, a ton of anxiety, because anxiety typically happens when we fear the future. And if you can fear a future of no people and no community, it's scary. I think social anxiety and loneliness are the biggest, probably like the biggest grievance we have right now with our social fabric. It's like, what do we do about that? You asked about the role, and I said a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, the role is that social anxiety gets a lot of people down. Social anxiety prevents a lot of people from stepping out of their shell. But it's also a really unifying thing. If we can bond over the fact that we all have social anxiety, we all experience it, I think that's the way we should go. It's just like pain. Nobody likes to be in pain, but pain is one of the most bonding things. The amount of support groups for cancer survivors, the amount of support groups for people who are struggling with a mental health illness, right? Like NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness. Pain brings people together. And I think we can flip social anxiety on its head and have that bring others together too. We just need to talk about it more.
Something that you talked about is almost overthinking, like after the fact of what you said. And I feel like we do that all the time in relationships and conversations. Is that like after the fact, you're like, oh, why did I say that? Why did I say that like this? But something that I found, especially during this podcast, is that like sometimes it's not as bad as you think. Because when sometimes I don't like the way I say something in the moment, and then I rewatch it. That's the beauty of what we do, is that we rewatch ourselves and we get that feedback, and we're like, wait a second, no, like that was fine. And then there are other times where we thought we killed it, and then we watch it back and we're like, oh, wait a second. So it's tough because like in the moment of those conversations, it's really hard to gauge how well you're doing in a way. So it almost comes down to like, and I would love your what you think about this. Like it almost comes down to like your subconscious, like in the moment ability to have a conversation. Does that sound right? Do you think?
Yeah, we call that the intrapersonal communication. It's communicating to ourselves. And then there's interpersonal, which is you and I, and then small group, and then mass communications. And at every level, there's always going to be some level of anxiety, right? Like,
yeah.
Oh, I shouldn't have said that, or I should have said that. Oftentimes what I do, especially for podcasts and for stuff that goes online, I tell myself that I'm sure I could have done better, but the fact that we're showing up to have the conversation says a lot. And I thankfully, I have like an advanced degree in communication. I have a podcast about communication. I taught public speaking. I write a newsletter about communication. So there's credibility there, but at the same time, I don't have the pressure of being like the leading academic who is in front of giving the president advisory, right? So I just have to remind myself, hey, it's low stakes in the grand scheme of things, right? With what we do with content, there's never big emergencies compared to a different role like healthcare. So yeah, intrapersonal communication, I think most people get stuck there. They get stuck talking to themselves, which prevents them from talking to other people.
Yeah, I also think it's also like any conversation or interaction we have, it's lower stakes than we set it out to be because the other person doesn't really care. Because I'm sure, because the thing about any conversation is that the other person is thinking about themselves, right? And so a lot of times what I find when I struggle most in conversations is when the other person is talking and I'm just thinking to myself, like, what am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? But something I learned is that like when you actually like focus and listen to what the other person's saying, like chances are you're going to come up with something witty to say back. You're going to come up with something that adds to the conversation more instead of thinking about what am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? Like in the middle of while the other person's talking. So I think a lot of it, and I would love your input on this, is being present in a way. Like I feel like that's the most valuable conversation advice in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I've already noticed that you do well is you prompt really well. So you'll share an observation, you'll share something in mind, and then you say, hey, I'd love your input. And it's not like you have a big question. It's being able to share an observation and we can relate over that. Then I can add something to the conversation. Then you can add on top of that. It is very natural. It's quite intuitive. Historically, whenever I told people I studied communication or I taught communication, I would get people who'd be like, that's common sense. We all communicate. You know, be it from the cashier to the maintenance man in an apartment to an attorney who's litigating in a courtroom to the President of the United States giving speeches, right? We all communicate. But I think, unfortunately, it's not common sense because it's become less common. It has become less common to have face-to-face interaction, to have physical togetherness. There's some really interesting statistics out there, like the amount of alone time's going up, the amount of spending time together is going down, the amount of FaceTime calls or phone calls compared to the amount of in-person conversation. So it is fascinating how intuitive it is, yet we just need to invest some time into how we're actually doing it.
What really is the difference between something like this, doing like a remote conversation versus in person? And I even find too that the conversations I have, the episodes I've had in person tend to go a little more smoothly. And what is there something to that? The fact that it's in person?
I think so. I think we were wired. The majority of the human existence has been interacting in person, right? So our brain is very well wired to whenever, like, I'm like, okay, I'm about to talk with Brian. If you walked in the room and your fists were balled up and you're like, like, here we go, I'd be like, what's going on? I can't even see your hands right now. So
yeah,
there's a lot of things that our brain is trained to do that we can't do online. And therefore we overcompensate for it, right? Like we want to sound a bit more witty or we want to have a nice background. During COVID, we called it Zoom fatigue, people who were constantly on Zoom calls, because it's not natural. What we're doing right now, there's actually more energy expenditure compared to if we were in person, because in person, there's more rewards. It's more refreshing to us. It satisfies more senses, right? Like if we were in person at a coffee shop, we could both smell the coffee. I could come up to you and I'd shake your hand. Depending on how close we were, we'd give each other a hug. We could punch each other after a good joke, like things like that. And I think the more senses we evoke, typically the greater rewards and benefits we're going to have. And this matches up with research. Like I had Jeff Hall, who's one of the leading professors for the Relationships and Technology Lab at Kansas. He's a Harvard fellow right now for the Berkman Klein Center. And he did research looking at different modalities. So text messaging, phone calls, video calls, email, in person, and seeing the rewards from that, like how rich it was, how it made people feel. And on average, people prefer in person. That being said, you should still send a text rather than doing nothing. But if you can, see if you can get in person.
What did COVID do to us? What do you think of the effect that COVID had on just our social skills? Because that's really when, like, work from home wasn't really like a popular thing until COVID. I mean, some people work from home. Like my dad always worked from home his entire life, but that was like a weird thing to do. Like not a lot of people did that. Everyone just went to the office. What effect has COVID had on our social skills?
The biggest answer would be atrophy. Our social muscles atrophied a lot. Like our biceps, our triceps, our traps. If we don't work out, we're going to lose it. So we talked less. We were in social situations a lot less. We didn't have to interact with strangers as much as we did in the past. We were actually encouraged not to interact with strangers. We were encouraged to stay away from people. And due to that, we got worse. There's Adam Grant. He put up a piece in the New York Times talking, expect a lot of awkwardness. That was like the byline. And the reason was we're not as good with people anymore because we don't have the practice. We can practice more. We can get back to where we were. Another thing that COVID did to us was that it introduced, like you said, a virtual workforce. It was around, but now it's around even more. Historically, after you get past the age of 30, you make most of your friends from work. This is like the American Friendship Project just published this on, what was it, mid-July, they published the largest friendship research project done of American friendships. And what they saw was that after 30, people make their friends at work. That's the number one source of friendship. But virtually, that number doesn't align. It's a lot less virtually. So whenever you push people to virtual workforces, that takes the social infrastructure away that we have. It also encouraged people to be more mobile. I mean, like COVID initially, don't travel, but after COVID, since you're virtual, you can travel a lot more, which decreases like in-person community, because typically for in-person community, you want to be around for a while to get to know people. So there's definitely some impacts. I hear a lot of people say it's like irrecoverable, but I don't think so. I think we've all been out of shape. We've all had a hard time. I do think we can get back to social fitness.
And that's a fascinating point about how it's like a muscle that needs to be trained. It's also, I mean, another analogy to think about. It's like warming up in a way. Like that's the best way to have the best conversation possible is almost like warming up to it. And I hear people talk about this if they like go to a bar or something, they try to have small conversations with other people just to warm up to it.
Yeah.
I think that's another factor of it too, is it's not only the muscle that needs to be trained over time, but it's like in the moment you almost need to warm up a little bit. A great example is today, like I woke up this morning, went to the gym. When I said hello to the front desk person, my voice like cracked. Like I was like, It was like I just woke up and I didn't have that. That was my first conversation of the day. But then I warmed up to the point where now we're having this conversation. So what's the role of that, of like warming up into it?
Oh, it's so good. My top 3 public speaking tip would be, if you can, talk to the people you're going to be speaking to before you actually get on the stage. Be it the person who set up the event, being a bit more inquisitive, asking questions, people in the audience, if you're consulting, the team you're going to be consulting, the more social, it's like footage, the more social experience that the two of you have together, the easier it's going to be for you to talk to them. I love what you were saying. If I can talk to more strangers, they call it social diversity. There's a socially diverse portfolio. It's whenever you're able to talk to a lot of different people who are in a lot of different social categories. For instance, your wife, your husband, your significant other, that's one category. Your family member, that's another. Your neighbor, your friend, your coworker, your best friend. All of those are different social categories. And the more diversity we have there in a single day, typically we can attach that to our well-being and how we feel that day. So if you can challenge yourself to talk to a stranger, to text a friend, to say hi to a coworker, to say hi to your wife, like all of that in one day, you're going to have a better day. And more than likely, the last conversation you have, you're going to feel a lot more socially in tune than the first conversation you have, because you warm up, like you were saying.
So talking to people that we know versus strangers, are those like two separate skills in a way? So let's say you go through your life and you only talk to your loved ones, you only talk to your close friends, and then but you don't really have interactions with strangers. Are you like not going to be as good when you do talk to strangers? Is it like is that like a separate muscle that you need to train? Just like that you need to train is like having small talk with people that you don't know.
Yeah, I definitely encourage training that. And the big reason why is it's a different game. It's talking to people we don't know is typically harder. It's going to require more energy from us, and it's going to give us less what they call like rewards. Because whenever I'm talking to someone I don't know, I have to figure them out. I have to figure out their pacing. Sometimes I may speak over them because typically someone else I'm talking to, whenever they go a bit higher, that means they're asking a question, but I guess they're going a bit higher because they have another thought they're going to. There's all of these considerations we have to make when talking to strangers. We have to see if we're safe around them. Do we trust them? Are they funny? A lot of things that we go through calculations. But if we can get good at it, then I would strongly encourage that. It's like the toolbox. If you can get good at talking to strangers, and typically the way to get good at them is to talk to them, but also to see that they're just like us. You mentioned how we think about ourselves a lot. We call that the spotlight effect. We think everybody's thinking about us when truthfully they're not. They're thinking about what they got going on. So I would definitely encourage that. The hard part, though, about creating new relationships, initiating conversations with strangers, is since it is harder and since we get less rewards, we're more likely to talk to people we already know. And the reason why that's easier is because we've already figured that out. We've invested all the time to know, like, okay, Brian likes cracking jokes. Maybe his sense of humor is different than mine, but we can still crack on together pretty well compared to this stranger. And I know it's going to be chill hanging out with Brian, and I feel fulfilled by that after because we have a good friendship there. So we end up talking to people we know more than we don't know, and there needs to be a balance there. If we ever find ourselves insulated in our tribe, that typically can get bad, especially the more time you add on there.
Yeah, I feel like a good real world example of this is like if you're at like a party or like you're with like you're at like a social event where like you know some people and you don't know others, you're a lot more likely, it's like subconsciously you're a lot more likely to stand by the people you know and talk to them, but like the people you don't know, you're just like really uncomfortable and you don't even like deal with them. Like, and then like so you could like at like a party situation or like a social setting, like there's always that awkward moment of like if you're by yourself, but there's people around you, right? But like the people you know, maybe they went to the bathroom or something, and you're kind of just standing there awkwardly. So that's a good real world example of like being at like a party or like a family, like even like a family party or something where you know everyone. Like you're going to gravitate towards the people you're closest with.
Yeah, and that's. I remember I went to a wedding in North Carolina. I knew one guy, the guy who invited me to the wedding, and being there was really hard. And I was in North Carolina. I went to graduate school there. That's where I taught public speaking. So I think I had this identity that I felt I had to fulfill of being the social guy and being someone who was really natural at conversation, acquire friendships real quick. But feeling that pressure and feeling isolated, it doesn't feel good. It's terrible. It's why you go to prison and you get in trouble in prison and they put you in isolation, right? It's even worse than prison, is being socially isolated. So if we can avoid that's ideal. But those moments where we feel that way, it's a really good indication that we need to acquire more social connection. And that's why I think loneliness is really helpful. I think a lot of the research and content people are creating on loneliness is really good. I don't really like it when people are like, here's how to beat loneliness, here's how to cure loneliness, because I think of it, and many people think of it as thirst and hunger. Thirst communicates to us that we need to drink. Hunger communicates to us that we need to eat. Whenever we experience those sensations, we need to do something about it. But we can't, it's not like we can cure thirst forever. Like we're going to be thirsty at some point if we work out, or same thing, like you can't cure loneliness forever. If whenever I had like right now, some of my family is going through some health problems, and the thought of thinking if something bad happens to him, that makes me lonely. And that doesn't mean I don't have a good social support system. It just means that I need to attune to that. I need to know what's going on. And maybe I do need more social connection. So,
So let's say someone is practicing that muscle of talking to people, like talking to strangers, like you said, like that's the best way to practice. But when you're in the heat of the moment of the conversation, let's say you approach a stranger, are there any like practical tips or things you can say to really get a conversation going and build chemistry with someone that you don't know?
In conversation, open-ended questions are really helpful. Open-ended questions get people rolling, especially if you get a well-timed, well-fashioned open-ended question. You can get people rolling for an hour if you ask them something. I'm sure you've done that on the podcast. Like you ask a question and you just chill, you sit back. But
do you mind giving some examples of open-ended questions?
There are a few different formats you can think of good open-ended questions. One structure that I like a lot, this is just a heuristic so people can remember it. It's HEFE, it's HEFE. And you've probably heard of the Ford method. It's kind of like, it's similar to the Ford method. The Ford method was FORD. When you're in conversation, you can look at what people do for, family is what the Ford method says. So like you can talk about the family. The O is occupation. What do you do for work? The R is recreation. How do you like to have fun? The D is dreams. In the future, where would you like to be? That's been around for a while. I think it's cool. But I like the HEFE, which is hobbies, entertainment, food, friends, and environment. The reason why I like that one more is it seems a bit more accessible. When we talk about like words like occupation and recreation, we don't throw those around that much, but we do talk about our favorite food a lot. We talk about friends. We talk about our environment. Like your environment, like you're sitting in outer space, right? No lights. I have a little green thing out here. I have this out here. But if you're at a party, you can talk about that a lot. Like, here's that's a cool TV. Like literally your physical environment. So if we attach the HEFE onto like a narrative method, so narrative being beginning, middle, end, how things started, how things are, and how things finished, that's a pretty good rubric to having good questions. So if we want to do a practice here, like HEFE, so we could talk about food. So like whenever you like when you were a kid, so we attach beginning in the narrative to food. Whenever you're a kid, what was your favorite thing to eat? Right? And they can talk all about that. What are you currently enjoying? Is there a restaurant you've always wanted to go to? So that's beginning, middle, end. And you can add that on to everything. So having structures like that are really good, but it's only as good as your ability to listen and your ability to assess what people actually like talking about. Passion is a word I hear a lot, like get people talking about their passion. There's a lot of pressure there because sometimes we don't really know what our passion is. We don't really know. I think a lot of us associate that with like our calling or what we're supposed to be doing in life. But there are a lot of things that people know a lot about, they're interested in, or they've experienced. So knowledge, interest, and experience, if you can find something in there and then ask those questions. But that's really good when you're in a conversation. Like I don't think if you approach a stranger and you're like, so what's the best thing? What was your favorite thing eating growing up? They'd be like, who are you? Like, what do I tell you? So I think close-ended questions are actually better at breaking the bubble of silence. So if you're at the gym, like, hey, are you on this machine? Like that's a very simple close-ended question. It's related to the task at hand. It's fit for the environment, or like, hey, you got another rep left? Or just like really small things like, oh, is the bus stop right here? Like, oh, do you come to the library often? Yes or no? Because the biggest thing is to get people talking. Even if it's like a small thing, then you're like, oh yeah, I've seen you before. Like, how long you been coming to the gym? And then you get rolling. So starting with a close-ended question that associates with the environment or task you're doing, and then I call them level 3 conversations. If you get a close-ended question, they respond. Then the third level is being able to enter into more of an open-ended conversation type deal.
Yeah, it's like warming someone up to be more vulnerable.
Yeah.
'Cause if you go right away to like trying those like really vulnerable, like open-ended questions, that can be almost like intimidating to people. And I also feel like too, where most people struggle, is the thing about open-ended questions that's really good is that it lets you go deeper into a topic. And I feel like what most people do is they kind of go from like one topic to the next, like what do you do for school, what do you do for work, where do you go to school, and like they just go like topic to topic. So I have a study that I found on the internet that I want to get your opinion on. And this is a quote. Studies suggest that within the first 90 seconds of meeting someone, people form a lasting impression, making the beginning of the conversation crucial for setting the tone. Do you find this to be true?
Within 90 seconds. I find it to be true. I think 90 seconds is pretty generous. 90 seconds is a robust amount of time. If you think about 90 seconds, people, like we just had the Olympics, people can run half a mile in 90 seconds, like the best in the world. So that is a pretty generous amount of time. I would say it's less than that, but the studies show, research shows, but the first impression is huge, right? Like we were talking about our ability to assess and read nonverbals, assess and read what our gut is saying. Our intuition's pretty smart. So if we feel like something's off, within 60 seconds, we should be able to get a general idea of how we're going to navigate the conversation.
Do you have any tips for those first impressions? Maybe, I mean, something that I heard you talk about is how important the nonverbal stuff is.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for how to make a good first impression when you're first initiating a conversation with someone?
Totally. All right. So nonverbals, openness is really important. If we can be it, one, it's not one size fits all, right? Like that's the first thing. But typically, openness is very important. The reason why I do a little caveat there, saying like it's not one size fits all, is because like I watch the UFC a lot, and they can get really open, but that's typically not a good thing. That means that you're about to get your head punched or you're about to get kicked in the head, something like that. But typically, whenever we're going in conversation, if we gesticulate, just meaning gesture, if we gesture, if we smile with our eyes. We read eyes so well. We don't realize this, but we are so good at reading people's eyes. That's really important first impression. The second thing is your tone and your actual, like, are you actually interested? Are you actually wanting to have the conversation? There's a sense of desire there. There's a sense of genuineness there. We can tell whenever people aren't really into it. We can also tell if people are asking a question to get to somewhere else, like we're a means to an end. So I think if we can be cognizant of what we're doing with our body, and then we put ourselves in situations that we want to be in, that's going to be really helpful for a good first impression. The last thing that I would add would just be being curious about the other individual is fairly magnetic. We love curiosity, because curiosity indicates to us there's something about us that someone else wants to know. So there's a lot of value there. We get self-esteem from that. And we like being considered. We like attention. That's just a natural thing for humans. So if you can be curious about the other person, they're more than likely going to like you.
And this is a tough thing with having like conversations with people is it's hard. It's almost hard to tell if someone doesn't want to talk to you at all. Like they just don't want to have the conversation right now, or they're just being socially awkward. And I feel like a lot of people can mistake someone just being a little awkward and not socially there for they don't want to talk to you and you're a terrible person and you suck. Is there a way that we can distinguish which is which? I feel like it's kind of tough, right?
I think the time frame would be the most helpful thing. So if we can get more data, if we can get more subject matter in there, then more than likely we're going to be able to make that decision. If we have someone who every single time we talk to them, they're not reciprocating. Reciprocity is one of the biggest things about having a good conversation. We want to do conversational turn taking. We want on either end, it can go bad. If you always find yourself asking questions to people and you're not volunteering any information about yourself, then you're not being vulnerable, and there's not going to be reciprocity for self-disclosure. I call it adding coverage. Like, you want to give people coverage by opening up so that they know you got some skin in the game, and they're going to be more likely to open up. It's one of the biggest critiques about dating is, I mean, he talked about himself the whole time, or all he did was ask me questions. I don't know anything about him. You have to find that middle ground. So the more time we get with people, we can typically tell, are you just being socially awkward? Maybe it takes a while for you to warm up, or do you just not want to be in this conversation?
So it really has to do with how much time you spend with them. You can gauge that.
Yeah, for detection, I think being with them the most would be helpful, because then we can get to know them. Deceit detection is really interesting, our ability to detect whether or not someone's lying. If you look at those, like the studies there, oftentimes people will think they're a lot better than they actually are at detecting deceit. Like, there was one study done on highway patrolmen, and the highway patrolmen performed the same marks, like they were just as good at detecting deception as a civilian, but they get, in their job, they want to be a bit better at detecting deception because they feel like they can read people better. And the more we're in conversation, the more we'll get better at it. But like deceit, one of the best ways to tell whether or not someone's lying to you is just spending time with them, because then you can actually understand, like, last time you said that differently, and I remember you were behaving that same way and you actually lied to me that time. So it's pattern recognition.
So I want to talk about something that everyone dreads, and that is awkward silence. And those moments, like, it's so uncomfortable. Actually, I had we talked about this on email a little bit. I had Andrew Bustamante on, the CIA spy, and he said that that's actually like a technique that they use to try to get people to open up to them, is like purposely creating those awkward silences, because it's so uncomfortable that like they need to say something, even if it's like a vulnerable thing that like almost like comes out of you. So what's your thoughts about awkward silences, and is there a way, should we embrace them, or should we just, like, are there techniques we can do to almost like fill in the gaps?
I like what you said about what Andrew had said, because I also think about silence a lot, but I never thought about intentionally creating awkward silence. That's interesting. Like getting to a point in the conversation to where maybe, according to the conversational turn taking, maybe it's your turn to say something, but you intentionally avoid it so that they'll volunteer more in the conversation. That's fascinating. I want to look more into that. Silence is incredible. Silence, whenever you think about silence, they say, there's that one phrase of like, silence can speak louder than words, right? Like when someone chooses not to say something, when there's silence in the room, what people choose to do in result to that, our ability to fill silence is one thing. Like that guy I mentioned who's going around the world and talking to 10,000 people for 1 hour at a time. He has gotten to the point, I asked him about silence, he's gotten to the point to where he has so many different frameworks and subject matter in his head to where if he feels like there's a lull in the conversation, he's like, so you mentioned ballet. Did you ever struggle with any injuries? Right? Like he can go to something and he can fill that silence well. I am more on the side of silence is a part of any interaction. Silence is, in my head, when you're working out, you put the barbell up and you bring the barbell down. And us filling conversations is like bringing the barbell up. If we were to be in a conversation where there wasn't any silence, it's like we're not doing the full rep. And we need to be a bit more generous with our silence. We need to be a bit more comfortable with our silence. It's hard when you're hosting a podcast. Like, I don't know if you feel this way, but I was on someone's podcast, and then a while later, I had them on my podcast. I felt a lot more pressure to fill the silence when they're on my podcast, because I felt like the responsibility of me as a host was to keep things moving, which it is in some sense, but it just made me less comfortable to silence. So we do need to be more comfy to silence. It's a cultural thing too. Typically in the West, we fill silence more than in different cultures. Different cultures actually, like there's this really cool story about a guy who was picked up from college. He finished his first year. His parents came to the dorm. They unpacked the dorm, and they had a 2-hour drive back home. And in that drive, it was radio silent. And then they got home, and a lot of people would be like, what happened? Like, what argument was there? But truly, they were relishing, they were enjoying each other's presence so much, and they didn't need to fill it with words. So it's natural for us to want to fill silence because we're kind of wired to like say something, you know? But truthfully, if we can get to a point where we're more comfortable with silence, it's going to help people who may not be as socially savvy. It'll help them get time to think. It'll help people maybe say something they've been wanting to say, but they can't find an opening and they just need a really big opening. It can be a really good tool.
Yeah, and this relates to what we were talking about before, how it depends on your relationship with the person. Like if you've known someone for years and you're good friends with them, like you can sit in a room in silence with them and not feel awkward at all. But if you're like, let's say like everyone can relate to the situation where you're with your friend and then you're with some like your friend's friend that you just met, you have no idea, and then your friend goes to the bathroom or something and it's just you two by yourself and there's that silence, then it gets uncomfortable, right?
Yep, it gets really uncomfortable. And I think the key thing to know there is that the friend's uncomfortable at the same time. And knowing that is really helpful. Knowing that it's humanity. It's the human experience. And more than likely, either the friend who went to the restroom, they're laughing about it, thinking about that discomfort, or they're like, oh man, I don't want to leave you two alone, but I'm going to have to, or else, you know, like I really have to go to the restroom. So it's funny how everybody's thinking about it, but in the moment there is that discomfort and you have to figure out what to do about it. It is a joy though. Like it is a privilege because that means that we're interacting with new people, and it means what potentially on the other end of the silence could be something awesome. It could be a new friendship, a new conversation. So it is a privilege because that means that we're putting ourselves out there.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into nonverbal communication. So I have a quote from Dr. Albert Maribin. 7% of communication is verbal, 38% is vocal, and 55% is nonverbal. While this is context specific, it highlights the importance of nonverbal cues in conversations. What's your reaction to that quote? What do you think? How much do you think nonverbal communication contributes to a conversation?
Whenever I hear the breakdown, I'm always fascinated by how they determine the breakdown, right? But on all marks, basically no matter where you see the breakdown, you see that nonverbal communication is always the majority. This makes a lot of sense because we spend a lot more time reading nonverbal communication than we do analyzing and assessing words, like articulated thought. Just at a base example here, if you and I were at a grocery store and we're walking to one another together, I register you as an individual, and immediately there are things happening in my brain. You know, immediately if you walk towards me and you're wearing a black trench coat with a black coat on, you have your head down, I'm like, compared to if you have like a LA Dodgers shirt on with shorts and sandals. I'm like, different vibes. Immediately as we're walking towards each other, we're thinking different things. How he's walking, why isn't he looked up? Is he with anybody? Why is he in this aisle? Why is he pushing across that way? He kind of has a limp. All of these things we're registering. Now, that's just like walking towards up to one another. Then initiating the conversation. What are they doing whenever I'm talking to them? Whenever they're speaking, why are they speaking that way? And then the big thing is like whenever we say something, what's their reaction? And then we're constantly reading their reactions. And they say verbal too. That's like tonality, that's pitch, that's speed, that's volume. All of those things, think of a phone call. When you put those together, we can determine a lot as well. So like, that's just a conversation at a grocery store. But we're actually talking to one individual there. Then we go to the DFW airport. There's thousands of people all around us. All we're doing is looking at one another and reading people's nonverbal communication. It becomes part of the social script. It's automated. I know to keep moving this way. I don't really think twice about anything until something goes haywire, until somebody throws their luggage or pushes somebody, and then all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, something's happening, and then immediately I'm going in there. So most of our time is spent reading nonverbals, and due to that, we have a lot of. It's also the last thing is like the evolutionary side. It's also the most unforgiving, our inability to read nonverbal body language. If we have someone who's very upset, and they got us in a room by ourselves, our inability to read their nonverbal body language that, hey, something bad's about to happen, is a lot more punishing than our inability to, like, did he say what I think he said? You know, like, we have to be able to read nonverbals. If we can't, then it gets really hard.
I feel like part of it too is just it's almost like a feeling that you get. It's not necessarily like a conscious thought, right? It's like you can kind of tell if someone's in a bad mood sometimes, right?
Yep.
And you can tell if they're in a good mood. But at the same time, the way they could be talking could be completely different. They could be trying to mask it or hide it, but you almost have that like internal feeling. Like you don't really consciously think about it. It's like you almost like feed off of like their mood, right?
Yeah. You know, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you though? Hearing
Yeah.
the tone there, and we tune that. It's like when we're babies, we have the 128 megabyte processor whenever it comes to reading people. When we're 1 year old, maybe 256. But by the time we're like 18, these things are multiple terabytes. Our ability to read people, and it becomes subconscious. It's like the Olympian who plays table tennis. One of the best ways to throw them off is to be like, "What? How exactly did you do that?" Because everything's muscle memory, and you have to follow your gut. Like the moment you feel like something's off. Like I got a call the other day, and it was a pyramid scheme, multi-level marketing. Like, hey, if you could do this and invite this person, and immediately I was like, like this feels weird. Why can't you tell me about the presentation? Why do you want me to be in their attendance and not tell me? And as soon as we feel that, that's the indication typically of something going wrong, rather than an indication we need to investigate. I would say more than likely, like, okay, something's off here.
And I think that also emphasizes the importance on our end to be as authentic as possible, because
Yes.
we need to understand that people pick up on stuff, and it's tough because you can't see yourself, right? So you could be making like facial expressions or like doing body language that shows that like what you're feeling or what your intentions are different than what you're like saying with your words, because we know we can like hear what we're saying, like we can understand what we're saying, but there's no mirror most of the times when we're talking to people. It's just straight looking at them.
Yeah, authenticity is a social service, right? We are doing a disservice to our loved ones, to those around us, if we're being inauthentic, because it's a form of gaslighting. We're telling them like, oh no, that's a false positive. Like truly, we can tell that an individual is not being authentic most of the time. And then if we say something about it and they're like, no, I am being authentic, then we question our ability to recognize and read what's going on. And if this is how people go insane, right? Like in the worst of situations, when someone's told something and they keep being told something and everybody backs it up, then they believe that thing. And it's conscious rewiring of the social cognition that we have. So we need to be authentic. Also, doing self-evaluation can be really helpful. Whenever I was doing public speaking training, that's like a really big thing, is if you can watch back yourself. I watched back myself on a podcast I was on recently, and I've touched my mouth a lot. I found myself like whenever I was talking, maybe I was about to say something, I touched my mouth. So with this conversation, I'm a bit more intentional about like, hey, don't touch your mouth, because it doesn't add any constructive value. It's just something that you find yourself doing subconsciously, despite it helping the conversation.
No, yeah, that feedback, especially for me, that feedback has been huge. And
Yeah.
the progression I have from when I first started to now, it's really getting that feedback. And like you said, you point out stuff like, oh, I didn't like the way I said that. And like,
Yes.
but in the moment you don't realize that. And so what's tough though is that like the majority of people don't have podcasts, and the majority of people don't listen to themselves talk, so they don't really know how they don't really know how good they are at speaking in a way. Do you have any tips for how to improve? We've talked a lot about what to say and how to say it in your body language. Do you have any tips for how to act, like how to like pronunciate, how to like improve your dialect, how to not stutter, how to actually be clear when you're talking?
The diction, enunciation. I know there's people like Chris Williamson, the podcast host. He pays money for diction coaches to help him train that. Now that's his way of, that's his living, right? Is his ability to articulate his thought, his voice. Not all of us are doing that, but it's an indicator that we can get better at it, that there's progressibility. Whenever you, like, one of the best ways to think of this, one of the most helpful ways to think of this is to think of someone who's learning a second language. How do they do it? And oftentimes, the most effective thing to do is to either show up, do cultural immersion, or to watch sitcoms, to watch documentation of people interacting. Just Friends, The Office, you name it. And the reason why that's so helpful is we can find different people. We can see how different people respond to things. Oh, he said a joke and they laughed. And that's why we love sitcoms. It's a reminder to us what like life is like, right? They say sometimes sitcoms make people more lonely because they see someone who has all these awesome friends and they're doing all these awesome things all the time. And it kind of creates this longing like, ooh, I want that. I want to be in that situation. So if we're a bit unsure of how we're talking, I do think watching people who are inspirations to us, watching, for instance, Barack Obama. I know some people are like, terrible politician, great politician, whatever. But look at his ability to articulate his thought. What is it about Donald Trump that makes him so persuasive and effective with a certain group of people? What is it about him that makes him not persuasive and effective with a certain group of people? Typically, if you look at people in these high-level positions, there's a reason they're there. And one of the biggest reasons is they're able to connect with their desired audience, right? Like, if you look at presidential farewell addresses from the past 7 presidents, Donald Trump, whenever he was finishing up his last presidential term, had the lowest level of readability, meaning the most amount of people could understand what he was saying because he wasn't using these big, complex, fancy words. Now we think about the U.S. president being this really smart person, being the head of the government, the commander-in-chief, but he was really effective at using these simple words and being able to communicate with that. So that's like looking at people who are really good and why they're doing that. And then the second thing, just clarity and confidence typically goes back to like what you're thinking. Like I have a newsletter where I talk, there's like 10 rules and I go through and I give 10 different rules, but a lot of it is clarity, confidence, goes down to your social cognition.
Let's say someone is struggling to make friends. Especially, it's tough because in this digital world, we have so much access to people, but I mean, that doesn't translate to making friends. What's your tips for someone who maybe just wants to make more friends in the real world and not online? Is there anything they can do in their communities? And like, just how do we make friends if that's something that we're lacking?
So the data and the research on friendship, especially in America, very interesting. What it shows is that most of us have friends, we just don't prioritize them. We have a social network, at least more than 3 people. A lot of us make our friends through school, then work, and then it goes through institutions. It goes, we meet friends through another friend, and then what we do for fun. And I think that's like the main sources. But if we want to make more friends, I have a whole bunch here. So the first thing is to take an assessment of our current life. And that is, what does our current life have in it that we're really proud of? What does it lack? And we can go through, and oftentimes I like to look at your schedule. Like, how are you spending your time? They say time is money. It's the most precious asset. So if you're spending a lot of time doing alone activity, for instance, you're watching a lot of TV, you're playing a lot of video games, you're watching TikTok all the time, There's a lot of things that we can do nowadays by ourselves to get a lot of dopamine that we didn't have historically, and they're keeping people alone. And we can replace a lot of that time with people time. Initially, it's not worth the rub for us. It's not worth the exchange because TikTok's got it mastered. They've optimized it. They've hacked our brain, our dopamine releasing signals. No matter what day it is, no matter what time it is, we can hop on there and start laughing, start being entertained. Now, talking with strangers is not the case. It's not efficient. You can't go out there and in an hour have a best friend. The data shows it takes over 200 hours to make a best friend. It takes a ton of time. We can't go out there and predict what's going to happen. Human experience is very unpredictable. You don't know what I'm going to say in the next sentence. I don't know if you're about to interrupt me. So it's way different than like the controlled optimal dopamine releasing. Due to that, we spend a lot of time alone. But if we can make a commitment to maybe spend 1 hour less alone, and then we look at the existing social infrastructure in our town. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, which is about 100,000 people. It's going to be much different than someone who lives in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, or Manhattan, New York, right? There's going to be different social infrastructure there. Maybe there's a sports club that is existing and it's doing really well. If you're interested in a certain sport or a certain hobby that you have fun at, that's typically the best place to start. Because the people who show up to places to make friends will have a harder time than the people who show up to places with other people to have fun, and in the meantime they have friends. This is what makes networking events seem so stuffy. The only reason people are there is to get a connection that's going to get them ahead, rather than showing up to a place to do a thing and a byproduct is a connection. So if you can assess what you do that's fun, Robert Putnam, he wrote Bowling Alone. He wrote Upswing. He's one of the greatest minds when it comes to social connection. He says, join a running club. Just go join a running club. Jeff Hall, the Harvard friendship expert, he says, send a text, host a party. It's like these little tiny things, but I always say you do an assessment, you reach out, you go show up to a place, and then you recover. And the reason why I say recover is a lot of times we want more friends, but we don't realize the reason why we're not making a lot of friends is because we're incredibly stressed. It's because we're financially strapped. It's because for some reason we keep dealing with headaches. Oftentimes, the reason why we're lacking socially is because there's a deficit somewhere else. And we need to address that because it's a holistic issue. If you are dealing with a lot of financial stress, then maybe you do pick up a second job. That way you can get more financial stability and have more of a headspace to get out there. So recovery is so important in that.
I also think too that I've made a lot of friends through other friends. And
Yes.
so I think sometimes all it takes is a couple, right? And then from there, those people know people, and then those people know people. And it's a lot more natural that way, in my opinion.
In repetition too. If there's a way to where you can go to a club, an event, some type of thing, this is what's so good about church, is they say, Sunday morning every week, I'll see you here. And maybe the first 4 times you go, you don't really feel anything. But then week 5, you get caught up in a hallway with someone and they're like, oh, hey, I've seen you around. Very cool. Hey, that's a nice backpack. And you're like, oh, thanks. It's been perfect for medical school. Medical school? Really? My husband's a doctor. Boom. Something happens. Week 6. Oh, hey, that's your husband? Nice to meet you. Like, what's your specialty? What are you thinking about going into? Week 7, week 8. And it grows. So if you can find something that's consistent and get you in the same place socially, that's typically really good, like a rock climbing club or the Humane Society, or you go work for the university, something. I don't know. It's hard to tell because every place has different social infrastructure. But if you can build a local social net and then go digital, what's happening nowadays is we go to digital communities first. We go to the subreddits. We join the Discords. We join these LinkedIn groups, which is super, it seems so accessible and so customized to us. That can be helpful. I think there's a ton of great things happening for people who don't feel like they can express themselves and they find people. I think that's so great. But if we can get local support first, like actual people we can see and feel and touch, and then go digital, that's way more optimal.
So my last question for you is, if you had a minute with your younger self, what would you tell him?
I love that question. Is this a recurring question for every guest?
Yes, this is always the last question. Yep.
I love that. What would I tell my younger self? I would say that to respect your creativity. I love creativity. I think creativity is one of the best social traits you can have. Just being creative. Go have a conversation. Ask a question. For instance, that's a creative question. Ask a question. Go create something. I did not admire or respect my level of creativity because I thought creativity had to be like a drawing or a painting or a beautiful song. But there is so much room for creativity whenever it comes to conversation, whenever it comes to creating content, creating a video to help other people enter conversation. So respect your creativity, create something that makes you happy, and give it time. You know, things I created a year ago, people are discovering them now. And they reach out to me and they say, thank you for creating it. And I'm so glad I did.